A little less than a year ago, my friend Kylie and I had an idea for a YouTube video to watch and rank the top 75 highest grossing rom-coms by US domestic box office. The research required for such an ambitious video became our podcast, the Goldloppers Podcast. The challenge with creating the podcast, though, was that Kylie lives in Detroit and I live in New York, so we set out to do a podcast using Zoom that doesn't sound like we're using Zoom. This is how to remotely produce a podcast that doesn't suck. Hopefully. Now, it goes without saying that whether or not a podcast sucks is a matter of opinion. The Goldloppers Podcast may very well suck. You can listen to it and decide for yourself, but strictly in terms of audio quality, it sounds pretty darn good. The obvious first step when it comes to producing a podcast is to have a strong concept.
That's it. I'm out of ideas. We're closed.
I don't think it matters what that concept is, as long as it's important to you and can sustain an entire podcast. If you just want to shoot the breeze with a friend and put it on the internet, I won't stop you, but you're probably not setting yourself up for success. Let's look at the concept for the Goldloppers Podcast. We had 75 rom-coms total, so we decided to discuss one per episode. The idea was to watch the rom-com and take notes on our own time, then come together every week to discuss it and record the episode. This formula lends itself well to a podcast. We have a prearranged topic of conversation, the podcast itself works toward a larger end product, and we know for sure that we'll have something to talk about for at least 75 episodes. You don't necessarily need to have this rigid of a structure, but having a repeatable formula will make production a lot smoother.
Scratch that. How would one go about it?
I also want to say that when it comes to producing a podcast remotely, 2 is the magic number. I'm about to take you through our production process in detail, and you'll see pretty quickly that this kind of operation requires a good deal of work. Every extra person that you add to the mix makes your job harder and increases the likelihood that something will go wrong. It's going to be really tempting to have guests on your show and interview people that you find inspiring, but you're not Joe Rogan. You don't have a dedicated production studio and a whole team working on your podcast.
It's entirely possible.
Your guest will most likely be remote, and the odds are that they won't have the same microphone setup as you, so you'll have to deal with lower quality audio that doesn't match your pre-established sound. We've all been there. There's nothing worse than your favorite podcaster having a guest on their show with nothing but Zoom audio. It sounds awful. The only time the Goldloppers Podcast has ever had a guest was when my sister visited me in New York. Luckily, I happened to have an extra microphone setup she could use, and since we were recording in the same room, there was no latency to deal with. All that being said, though, it was easily the most time-consuming episode to edit. The third audio stream added an additional layer of complexity to the editing, and my sister wasn't used to speaking into a microphone like Kylie and I were, so her audio required the most adjustment in post. It was a delight to have her on, don't get me wrong, just be aware that adding guests adds complexity. Alright, let's get into the big stuff. Let's talk gear and production.
If you can see, the numbers all go to 11.
Right off the bat, I highly recommend that you throw the idea of video out the window. Producing a high-quality video podcast is expensive and time-consuming, especially when you have to deal with sending video files through the cloud. Get started with just audio, and if you want to incorporate video later, that's a choice you can make once you've gotten your feet wet. When it comes to gear, I recommend that whatever you choose equipment that's accessible enough that your whole hosting operation can build the same setup. I also recommend that setup not just involve a USB microphone. While a USB mic is an improvement over Zoom audio, it's no good substitute for a dynamic microphone and an audio interface. For those who don't know, the 2 main types of microphones you'll find are dynamic and condenser. To put it the most simply, dynamic microphones are more rugged and less sensitive. Condenser microphones are great, but they work best in a studio environment where there's absolutely no background noise. Since Kylie and I record in our respective apartments where we have little control over ambient noise, dynamic microphones give us a cleaner signal and a higher margin for error. Whatever microphone you use, it's probably going to require the use of an XLR cable. Since you can't connect an XLR cable to your computer, you'll have to use an audio interface to act as an intermediary between your microphone and your computer. For the Goldloppers Podcast, we really wanted to be conscious of our budget, so we bought 2 Shure SM58 microphones, 2 Universal Audio Volt 2 interfaces, and some basic pop filters and XLR cables. For headphones, I happen to already have a pair of studio monitors, but Kylie just uses whatever wired headphones she has lying around. This setup ran us about $350 a piece, which I understand is not a small amount of money, but in my opinion, this is about the bare minimum that you can spend and still achieve a professional sound. The Shure SM58 is $99, super durable, and sounds fantastic. The Volt 2 is $190, has a nice preamp, and is a really capable interface for someone like me who doesn't know all that much about audio. Hi, Editing Ethan here. I just wanted to say really quick that while I use the Universal Audio Volt 2 in case I ever have a guest in my apartment who wants to be on the podcast, Kylie just uses the Universal Audio Volt 1, which is the single input version of their interface, and it works just as well and is a little more affordable. If you have the budget for upgrades like the $400 Shure SM7B or a $150 pair of Audio-Technica headphones, knock yourself out, but these are luxuries and not necessities.
Hey, is this thing on? Hello, testing. Hey, good evening, how are you? Nice to see you.
When it comes to recording your podcast, I recommend patience. Above all, you want the process of producing your podcast to be fun and sustainable, so I strongly advise taking your time at the beginning to figure everything out. Kylie and I recorded and edited 5 whole episodes before we finally launched, and that patience really paid off. Firstly, we did a lot of testing. I use the digital audio workstation Logic to record and edit the podcast, and Kylie records on a program called Audacity. Logic isn't crazy expensive, but it's definitely not free. Audacity, on the other hand, is free and open source and is a more than capable DAW for producing a podcast. We record using a lossless audio file type called a WAV file. Since Kylie shares her audio with me via Google Drive, we use a lossless audio file to ensure that the quality doesn't degrade during transfer. I'll warn you though that WAV files are really big and will fill up your hard drive in a hurry. A fully edited hour-long episode of the Goldloppers podcast takes up about a gigabyte of storage, so keep that in mind as you consider your workflow. The sound quality difference between a WAV file and a more compact file like an MP3 is largely negligible to the average listener, so it's not the end of the world if you opt for a more manageable file size. To test our equipment, we hopped into a Zoom meeting and just started throwing spaghetti at the wall. We tried a bunch of different gain levels and microphone placements until we found a setup that worked well for both of us. In my experience, you want your pop filter 3 or 4 inches from your mic, and you want to sit in a place where you're comfortable and you don't have to move much to hit your mic's sweet spot. To dial in the sound, I adjusted the gain on my interface so that reasonably loud speech wouldn't peak my microphone. Looking at the decibel meter in Logic, I shot for conversational speech to land around -9 to -6 dB. I would then have Kylie send her test files to me, I'd compare hers to mine, and I would have her tweak her audio settings so that her waveforms looked as similar to mine as possible. Once we got our audio settings dialed in, we recorded and edited practice conversations until we were ready to record the first episode. I mentioned earlier that we recorded 5 episodes before we started releasing them, and this proved to be the perfect amount. I'd never edited in Logic before, and I also wasn't entirely sure how I wanted the podcast to flow and sound when all was finished. By the 5th episode, I'd spent about 30 hours learning to edit in Logic, and I had a much better idea of how I wanted the episodes to sound. After finishing the 5th episode, I went back and listened to the first episode, and it sounded awful by comparison. So I took everything I'd learned from those first 5 episodes and I went back and re-edited the earlier episodes until they matched the style and flow of that 5th episode. By the time all this work was done, the editing process was so robotic that I didn't even need to listen back to the episodes anymore. I could edit the whole thing in one pass and just put it in the mail.
Anybody know anything about editing audio tapes?
Now I want to take some time to physically show you how I go about editing an episode. I just want to say right off the bat that the way I edit is not the end-all be-all. This is just the way that works best for me. My editing process is involved, and an hour of podcast audio probably takes me between 3 and 6 hours to edit, so bear that in mind as I break it down. I start by bringing Kylie's audio into Logic and lining it up with mine. We make the lineup process pretty easy by just starting our respective recordings on the count of 3 and then exchanging a couple hellos. The placement of our tracks doesn't need to be super exact because of the latency. I just try to make sure our hellos don't overlap. Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Ethan.
Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Ethan.
If Kylie's audio is noticeably quieter than mine for whatever reason, I'll utilize Logic's normalize region gain function to play with her waveforms until they look more like mine. And there's nothing scientific about the way I do this. I literally just plug in different numbers until our waveforms match, undoing if I don't get it right the first time. As far as effects and EQ go, I don't use a whole lot. I use a basic parametric EQ that looks like this, and a compressor that makes the loud bits of our conversation a little quieter and the quiet bits a little louder. You might also consider a de-esser if your S's are quite loud, and an expander if you have persistent background noise like traffic outside your window or an air conditioner near your recording space. Since I dialed in my interface's settings during the testing phase and haven't changed them since, I also haven't changed the EQ chain for the podcast at all since about the 10th episode. I went through and made a recording template with all of the EQ and sound effects already present, and I've recorded directly into that template ever since. If your DAW doesn't have the option to save a project as a template, you can always take a finished episodes project file, duplicate it, delete all of the audio aside your regular transition sound bites, move them to the front of the timeline on mute, and voila! Recording template. Once I'm done recording my end of the podcast, I just wait for Kylie to send me her audio via Google Drive and I add it to the timeline and start editing. The actual editing itself is where the tedium sets in. I go through the entire episode and edit out every single instance of Zoom latency that breaks up the conversation. I also manually tinker with the audio levels to make sure the audio balance is consistent. I don't like to use a ton of compression because too much compression can make your speech sound lifeless and robotic, which means that there are a good deal of peaks and valleys that I have to fix manually. Since our regular speech hovers around -9 dB, I set the compression threshold to -20 dB with a compression ratio of 3:1. If you're not familiar with what compression actually does, that compression ratio of 3:1 means that for every 3 decibels over my established threshold of -20 decibels that the audio goes, the software lowers the volume by 1 decibel. My compression settings in Logic look like this. I'm sure a real audio engineer would change these settings slightly, but they've worked out fine for us so far. Compression and EQ really just comes down to your taste, so I think it's best to learn as much as you can about them and play around with your mix until you get the sound you want. But I'm definitely not the person to teach you how to do that, so I've linked some more detailed tutorials in the description. Like I mentioned before, the compression helps with the peaks and valleys, but it doesn't do all of the work for you. If Kylie or I trail off at the end of a sentence or say something quietly, I boost that section and replay it to make sure that it sounds seamless. My least favorite thing in a podcast is when I have to crank the audio to hear something quiet and then turn it back down when the speaker returns to a normal voice. I never want one of our listeners to have to do that, so I take the extra time to manually adjust the audio throughout. Again, some may think that this is tedious psychopath behavior, but I think the end product is worth the effort. I also go through and cut out all of the ums, ahs, and any other vocal space filler using Logic's marquee tool, and then ripple deleting the selected area. Then I just listen back to make sure the edit isn't noticeable. Above all, I want the podcast to sound smooth, but not over-edited. If cutting out an interrupts the flow of speech, I'd rather just leave it in. This type of editing is something you'll get a feel for as time goes on. I use the same cutting technique when removing latency. I delete the pause, then extend each bit of freshly cut audio so it all blends together. Some people like to cut out breaths, but I like to leave them in because I think it makes the conversation sound more natural. And that's what just about the entire editing process looks like. I use reference headphones for a balanced sound profile and make sure I always edit in a quiet environment with my computer's volume set to the same level at all times. I'm sure these sound like no-brainer tips, but I needed no-brainer tips when I was getting started. Also, these Audio-Technica ATH M60Xs are my life. These things sound incredible. I can wear them for hours without needing a break, and at $150, they're pretty affordable for the quality. This is not a sponsor, by the way. These things have just been my daily drivers for years, and I love them.
Now what?
Once each episode is edited, I export, or in Logic's case, bounce the finished file and upload it to Buzzsprout, which is the hosting website we use for the Gold Loppers podcast. By the way, I'm not sponsored by Buzzsprout, I just genuinely like their site and they've served our needs perfectly since we started. It services all major platforms, doesn't cost a whole lot per month, and is really easy to use. They have a variety of pricing options depending on how much audio you think you'll upload in a given month, and you can upgrade or downgrade your plan whenever you want. We use the 12 hours per month option, which costs $24 a month. We could probably get away with the 6-hour per month plan, which only costs $18 a month, but it never hurts to have a little extra headroom in case we have a few long episodes back to back. Beyond this, the only thing you really have to think about is marketing your podcast. Since we don't use video, our marketing is pretty low effort. We have an Instagram page that we post on every time we upload, and the post is basically just a movie poster with our podcast art and an episode number on it. If you don't record video, which I still recommend that you don't, your best marketing tool is just going to be telling the people that you care about to tune in.
You'd know that if you'd ever listened to my podcast.
Spoiler alert, most of them won't, but that's okay. We're not trying to get famous off this podcast. It's a research tool for a larger project, and it's really just for us. If you're trying to get famous by starting a podcast, you're barking up the wrong tree. Make something that you enjoy making and the universe will handle the rest. No matter what, I think it pays to keep your expectations low. I am endlessly thrilled that my mother and 4 other people listen to us talk about rom-coms every week. If that's not good enough for you, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Before I wrap this up, I want to touch briefly on how the podcast fits into my weekly schedule. Since Kylie and I both work jobs that give us the weekends off, we spend the weekend working on the podcast and release a new episode every Monday. We usually record on Sunday afternoon, so I spend a good chunk of Saturday editing the episode that's due to release and watching the movie that we'll be discussing the next day. If I don't have time for this, I'll watch the movie on Sunday morning right before we record instead. The rest of Sunday is dedicated to putting the finishing touches on the episode that's due to release, uploading it to Buzzsprout, and making the episode's Instagram post before I go to bed. I set the episodes to go live at 7 a.m. on Monday, and then I post on Instagram sometime before Monday lunch. As the weekdays go on, I try to do a little bit of editing every day. If I can get half the episode edited by Friday, it makes my weekend a lot smoother and gives me a lot more free time. We also do our best to always record a couple weeks ahead of where we're editing. So, for example, I'll edit and post episode 36 the same weekend that we record episode 38. That way, if we have to miss a weekend of recording, we still have an episode to post the next week and can make up for the lost recording session another time. And that's about it. After a year of podcasting, these are all of the tips and strategies I would implement for producing a fully remote podcast that doesn't suck. Hopefully. Am I doing anything horribly wrong? It's possible. If you're someone who knows more about audio than I do, you're more than welcome to go to the comments section and let me know what I could do better. I just ask that you be kind. And if you know less about audio than I do, I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something. The Gold Lobbers podcast is linked in the description if you want to check it out, along with all other pertinent links. Thanks for watching.